Good afternoon, everybody. All right,
Hey everyone.
Happy Wednesday, happy mid of the week. How are you doing, Tim?
Doing pretty good. How you doing, Juan?
Great. Always looking forward to this mid of the week break, and very excited that we're always getting more people coming joining us, and we got kind of a lot of people, a lot of names that look familiar, and a lot of new names too, which is always really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and today we have Corinna Turbes from Data Coalition. Welcome.
Nice to have you, Corinna. Yeah, we were one of the topics we were talking about kind of internally between and I were like was policy, and then we kind of chatted internally and we're like, hey, this would be a good topic to talk about, but I really don't know much about it. Let's go chat with somebody who does know. So internally, I know we're very well connected. Data.world is connected with the Data Coalition. So we're glad to have you here, and you can be part of this conversation and see where we go.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, for sure. So anyways, cheers, everybody. What are you guys drinking?
I have a gin and tonic.
Beautiful classic.
Awesome.
I like that. How about you, Tim?
I am drinking just some whiskey with a little bit of vanilla simple syrup.
Oh, that's a better. I always do let's see what I have in my bar, and then I looked up I had bourbon and tonic. So I looked that up quickly, and then I found out there's something called a BLT, a bourbon, lemon, and tonic. Except I didn't have lemon, so I had lime, and actually pretty good. It's a nice summer drink. So, anyways, cheers.
Yeah, cheers.
Hopefully,
I've had a lot of gin and tonics, but I've never had a bourbon and tonic. So that's definitely a little different.
No, it's actually pretty good, and I think it's some twist on the Japanese highball, which is also stuff like that with whiskey. But hey, so as always, anybody share us where you're coming from, where you joined us from, what are you drinking, and how do you got here? It's always cool to see where people are coming from. So anyway, so again, Corinna, thanks for joining us on this conversation, and kind of just like as a quick recap, what we've been talking about the last couple of weeks. I mean, we've really talked about like data personas. We've talked about kind of the features of a data catalog that are needed. Like last week, we talked about data lineage, which is one of those important features. We talked about knowledge graphs, but I think one of the things we'd like to go do now is kind of like we're just having this conversation about policy and the topic of data policy. So I just want to kind of kick that off with you, Corinna. Is like, what is data policy from your perspective? And by the way, I love if you can give us a little bit of intro of just talking about who you are and what is Data Coalition and what's your role, and then kind of
that'd be great.
Policy. Sure. So the Data Coalition is we bill ourselves as America's premier voice on data policy, and really our mission is to make sure that government data is governed by responsible policies that make sure that data is open, accessible, and high quality. And I function as the lobbyist for the organization, and as my boss just informed me, I am the only data lobbyist around. So as far as what data policy is, it's still growing up around, it's not as well defined as maybe, foreign policy or these other kind of issues. Prior to working for the Data Coalition, I was with the Council of Professional Associations on Federal Statistics, working with federal statistical organizations. So this was the Census Bureau, Bureau of Labor Statistics, and statistical policy is a little bit more well-defined, right? We have legislation that defines privacy standards and how we collect information and all of that. Data policy is a little bit broader. So this includes things like administrative records. What are some of these broader topics? How do we get good data sets to train AI? Those kinds of questions as they come up. So my job is to really work with I work on the federal level about what are the things that private sector and public sector really need to make good data available to the people who need it.
Okay, so what I think about data policy, and so I always wonder is how much of this is just actually kind of from the public sector, the government, versus actually we think about data policy from a private, like within your enterprise. Like, what is the overlap between there, and how much should the enterprise and private be thinking about data policies?
I think quite a bit, because, you know, imagine how many private sector companies rely on data that's produced from the Census Bureau. You know, so many people use both the decennial information, the American Community Survey, all of which, you know, even the monthly jobs numbers. And that's a number that is really put together through a variety of sources, including state data. So if the federal government didn't have good data management policies about how they were going to manage this massive data set that we get from the census, that we get from our taxes, that the Social Security Administration, how then private companies absorb that data and give their value add to it becomes a nightmare, right? I mean, we talk about the federal government has to manage its data the same way private enterprise has to manage their data. The difference is that federal data isn't proprietary.
So we've talked here a lot about just like the pains of just data integration. How similar or different is it in the federal government? Or is it just another big company, just like another company, but it's just much bigger, or they have very different types of needs, or they're very overlapping, or?
I think there's some very similar pain points, I would say, but also some unique pain points to the federal government. For example, the federal government has privacy protections that are informed by the Civil Rights Act that, you know, as we are thinking about how do we protect people's privacy and, you know, instituting good disclosure avoidance systems, there are minorities who are at risk, a disproportionate risk of disclosure and at a disproportionate impact if information were to be disclosed. That's something that the federal government is obligated to look after, that, you know, private enterprise isn't necessarily. But that same problem of, you know, the left hand not necessarily doing what the right hand is, you know, that is a big problem with the federal government. You know, one great example that's come up recently is the master death file. There was, you know, reports of the IRS sending out payments to people who are deceased. And that's because the connections between the master death file kept by the Social Security Administration and how the IRS can use that to distribute payments is not very clear. There's also data quality issues around that file, and, you know, because that pulls in from the states. So the same effective integration of data from multiple sources is a huge pain point for the federal government that is probably similar in a lot of these large private sector enterprises as well.
That's super interesting. And, you know, and I know one of the things, Juan, we've been talking about is, like, you know, how much of this is a people problem, how much of it is a technology problem, how much of it is a process problem. You know, I'm sure that you probably have, you know, people who are more process experts that are separate from the data experts, who are separate from the subject matter experts. You know, how do you navigate all that, and what does that kind of look like?
You know, that is a really great question, and I think is one of the biggest challenges I have as a lobbyist. You know, in a different type of policy area, say I were a foreign policy advocate or lobbyist, I would know exactly who to talk to. I would go talk to the chair and the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. I would talk to the State and Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Appropriations. I would know who to get to. But when you're talking about data, it impacts every subject area. So, you know, if it's the question of, I want to get machine readability as a standard for all federal data, there's no one person I need to talk to. You know, I can't reasonably talk to every agency that's in charge of a data collection. So it then becomes this tangle of even raising the awareness that it's an issue to, you know, some key allies who might be in influential positions, but it also might be the case that this isn't something that they've ever heard of before, and they're just trying to figure out how to, get funding to assist in affordable housing. Like that's their goal. And then convincing them that, well, you should take $40 million to fund machine readable, accessible, open data so you can make better decisions down the line becomes a really hard ask, right? Because they're just trying to get people into homes. So this issue of like subject matter experts usually know what data they want, but aren't necessarily aware of how to get that good data or the immense amount of effort that goes into it. So that's where a lot of what I come in is doing, is a lot of educating about how to get to where the point that they need. But the flip side of that is I don't necessarily know what they need. And so it's a lot of listening to understand the questions that they have and how I can help them get there.
So folks like you are serving as a bridge between like what people are trying to go find, and then you're actually go finding that data.
Yeah. And I would say, my background is, I have no background in data science, in statistics, or anything like that. My undergraduate degree is in linguistics and my master's degree is in national security policy. So this is something that if I have a question about it, I know policymakers are going to have a question about it. So I really rely on experts like data.world to help make me informative and help me be able to translate the data needs into policy answers.
So this is interesting, Tim. We've talked about on the personas, right? Like the producers, if we think about producers and consumers, right? You have that, what we've called the data product manager in a way. We can get a little bit more specific on the knowledge scientist stuff that we brought up before, but essentially you have people who are trying to consume data and people who are going to produce the data. And then there's this big gap, right? And that's where we've talked about those other personas of the data product manager. So seems like that's kind of the role that you play in a way.
Yeah.
Okay. No, I find this fascinating because you think about it, how you think like the government is it's like this weird different entity, but at the same time, it's just like just another big company who has the same types of problems as we do. But it's super powerful that we need to be able to understand the relationship and make sure that we want them to be successful because we're going to go use that data too. So.
And an organization that is, I'll be frank, not on the cutting edge technology wise. I always have to remind people that legislators and staffers are working with PDFs when they're writing these, 1,000-page bills. They are drafting and saving PDFs and sending them around to each other. So when you hear something like a machine readable data, that's not necessarily something they have that professional experience with. So, when asking them to imagine these sort of cutting edge technologies, it really takes a lot of vision, and these are people who are very smart, but they are attorneys, they are political scientists, so it's really a subject matter, the data literacy in Congress can be really challenging.
So yeah, that was the phrase that really came to my mind too, is data literacy, right? Like, I feel like that challenge is not just in, federal and not just in companies, it's kind of everywhere, right?
What are best practices that you've seen that enterprises can adopt from data literacy projects or data policies within their own companies? Or is it the other way around?
I think it would have to be the otother way around. I think you guys need to tell me what are the best practices so that when I'm talking to, CMS and the VA about how they're going to manage their electronic records, what can I tell them about what you have learned?
So what can we share, Tim? I'm sure that afterwards we'll open the conversation and people will have a lot to say about this, but in your experience, Tim, how are companies dealing with data policies?
No, that's a great question. And, obviously we're a little bit biased at data.world because we're always thinking about open data marketplaces and data catalogs. But I think the one thing that we have noticed is, taking a very metadata-driven approach to this, right? And actually trying to organize information in ways that is really accessible, and there's a lot of ways to do that, but I noticed that this is something that seems to be really popular on sort of the open and sort of federally available data. Obviously, companies are doing this a lot as well, but things like tags and taxonomies, and being able to say that, hey, these things over here are, maybe this kind of level of sensitivity or subject to these kinds of regulations versus these things here. So a lot of it seems to be a lot around organization and making that organization accessible to the consumers that are working with that data. I don't know if that's something that you also kind of see on your side as well as being something that kind of helps in terms of accessibility.
Yeah, and I think what you said reminded me of that. This is such a hard organizational challenge because you have to take all these people who have a different job to do and now are asking them to document their data, their metadata in a way that maybe they've never had to before. That it's really asking like an organizational and a culture shift, especially as we look at new laws like the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking, where we are now asking every agency to inventory their data sets. And if you are a claims processor at a federal agency, you might not necessarily see the reason for that, or it might not affect your job. You're not getting any extra money. You already have 80,000 things to do. So how can we make this as painless a process as possible and get a lot of the buy-in necessary from people within the enterprise to make that happen?
Yeah,
so
yeah, absolutely. And go ahead, Juan.
Yeah, so when I think about kind of policies, with data policies in a company, I think the first thing that comes up to mind is like, you got GDPR and CCPA, right? All the protection stuff, and you don't want data leakages and stuff. And that's what I'm thinking. I'm not seeing Pierre's question is in terms of data storage and data storage security, what are you seeing as like the standard operating procedures for data storage and security within the government? Like, I mean, you can imagine that they have a lot of very data that has to be super protected, right? How is that different or related or to what people are doing within the enterprise? And I mean, I'm thinking that they have to be super protective about that.
Yeah, so there are varying levels of security when it comes to privacy protections. So Title 26 is the law that protects IRS data. And this is data that is under lock and key. Like you are not, I think the Census Bureau is the only agency that IRS can share data with. And then, kind of a circle out from that is census data, which is locked up under what's called Title 13. And then beyond that, you have the law is called CIPSE, Confidential Information Protection and Efficiency acronyms, that protects their statistical data. But then you have these massive troves of administrative data that were not collected for statistical purposes, that were not, given these sort of informed consent as we think about it. But is there a way to protect that privately and use it in a way to aid evidence-based policymaking? So we're seeing a lot of attempts to tackle that. So there's things like the Census Bureau has been playing around with synthetic data as a way to protect its privacy using differential privacy. There's different access mechanisms. I know a lot of organizations right now are looking at how to tier access with different levels of security and multi-party computation and things like that. This is where we really get beyond my scope as a policy person, that there is so much math involved in things like this, especially like differential security and synthetic data. So the policy then is to, rather than, I would say, tackle these like individual technologies, is come together to come up with like a list of guidelines, a set of standards, a way of assessing risk that then the experts in the federal agencies can execute on. What are our priorities around privacy? Is this concept of informed consent something that we can that is tenable in this? that's where a lot of these like privacy questions around like the GDPR and the California privacy protection law really kind of come into place. We don't necessarily want to stifle innovation or research, but at the same time, we need to acknowledge that privacy and security are very real and an incredible asset to getting people to hand over their data. So that's where like the policy needs to come in as sort of guiding the ship. What are the criteria for how we do this?
That's kind of that line that I've been trying to understand. Well, like the whole GDPR and CCPA is like, I definitely understand and I agree that we need to have some sort of personal, I agree we have to have some sort of regulations, but at some point it's like, wait, it just makes life so complicated that like that if you think about it from the enterprise perspective and this whole topic about like data governance, it's fear, right? So I have to now, in addition to go figure out my day-to-day challenges of managing data, that I want to make sure that I'm providing clean data, quality data, everything. I now need to make sure, like, there's all this fear that's being that I need to be able to go deal with it. So, in addition to all the normal stuff I go deal with, now they've added all this fear that I have to go do. So you start adding all these kind of requirements on governance. It's like the reason I do governance is just to it's fear reasons. So it's like I'm basically policing, and it's kind of a protective measure. And I think governance has started out of that. And we really need to flip that around. I think we need to be able to kind of think about governance, not just from this policing measure, but how can I actually use governance kind of from the positive side? Like, can actually embrace it in the positive. I think that's this line that it got annoying. We got to figure out how to turn this annoying thing, which we need, but turn that into a positive. I think that's something we need.
Yeah, not just the lock and key approach, but actually how do you balance both sort of the security and, you know, exposing it and making it available.
Right. The analogy that someone from the Internet Privacy Association said earlier today that really struck with me: privacy is like the brakes on a car. You can go as fast as the cars can go because we have a braking mechanism. You know, it's that sort of, I thought that was a great analogy. That sort of security and safety mechanisms is what is going to allow us to go so much further with the amazing power of especially, you know, large data assets.
I'm going to take that analogy and I'm going to put it with like this governance. It's like, I think we've been kind of connecting, or at least I personally believe that governance has been more like that brake. It's like, I got to, like, the brake is always in front of you. But really, you got to think about governance as the whole thing, as like the engine that can get you forward, but also a brake that can slow you down when it's needed. And obviously, you don't get on a car just to go brake. You need to accelerate. You need to brake. You need to go right. I like that analogy. That's a good one.
That's actually a really interesting analogy, because, you know, if you keep on going with that analogy, maybe too much of governance these days is like, well, let's just not build any roads because that's scary. And, you know, let's make the speed limit 10 miles an hour because we don't want cars going too fast.
There we go.
Right? Instead of thinking of it, you know, more like, hey, if we just put the brake mechanism in there and we make sure that people can see out their windows, everyone's got visibility, right?
Right. Like, we have ways of making cars safe without, you know, making them, and there is limits, right? Like we do have speed limits, but they're reasonable speed limits as opposed to being 10 miles an hour.
They're 10 miles an hour. And then when you're on, and if you go to West Texas, it's not 65, it's 80, right? Because
right.
Things go just, I really, really like this analogy. It makes so much sense.
Yeah, and then if you go to Germany and you're on the Autobahn, there is no speed limit because they invest so much in not only their cars, their infrastructure that the cars run on. If we really want to beat this analogy.
That's interesting, yeah, because then maybe technology or, you know, your processes, eventually they evolve to a point where you can unlock, you know, easier access to things. Things like differential privacy are starting to go down that line of thinking of like, hey, what could we do? What could we enable here that could accelerate things, right?
And then we get into Formula One and everything, right?
All right, I can't do differential privacy and sports. That's like too far out of my. Like really pushing.
We're breaking the analogy now.
Hey, so talking about differential privacy, this is a topic I have been wanting to pay more attention, and it intrigues me so much because just 10 years ago, it was pure theory. It just came out of research, right? So Cynthia Dwork Frank McSherry, right? These are the folks who really came up with this differential privacy just 10 years ago. And now a lot of the motivation was to go, I mean, for like managing the census data, open data. I've always thought it's like, even like in data marketplaces, you think about where the world is going, what data.world is doing too. It's like, one thing is like, I'll give you access to the data. But the other thing is like, no, I'm not going to give you access to the data. I'm going to give you access to, you can ask queries, you can ask questions to that. And I'll make sure, right, through differential privacy that you're getting the good expected results. And I wonder how much of that differential privacy is going to start kind of being part of just day-to-day enterprise data, right? Because right now people can, people are sharing data. I'm sending data over over still FTP sites. People in insurance will send data like that. Like, are we going to really shift to a place where we're going to go in, not just share data through APIs, but also then have this differential privacy layer on that? I wonder about that. I don't know if you have any thoughts.
I mean, as far as federal data is concerned, how the census goes, so goes the rest of federal data. Because the Census Bureau just has the most data. That is what they're set up to do. And they are in full bore for differential privacy. The 2020 census data projects will be differentially private. Starting in 2023, American Community Survey data, I believe, will be differentially private. And then from there, you have the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the Economic Research Service, which administers SNAP data, all relies on what will soon be differentially private data from the Census Bureau. It's coming through the sluices. There are, I think, some legitimate concerns about researchers from this on both sides. Steve Ruggles out of the University of Minnesota, IPMS has some, and Dave Van Ripper have some methodological concerns about this. So I don't want to say that differential privacy is, solves all of our problems as far as how we use data, but it's coming. It is the wave of the future. So
you think that's all, not just in government, it's something that's going to be also kind of in the private sector?
I don't know. I think that's a question for you. If you were to use a public data set that was differentially private, how do you then integrate that into the data sets that you have? Do you have to then integrate that epsilon value? How does that work? Because I think that's still a question that some of the federal statistical agencies are curious about as well.
Interesting.
Yeah, I don't know that there's necessarily a good answer to that on our side. I'm curious what you think, Juan, but I think right now a lot of companies, that we talk to especially are finally starting to get onto the path of like, oh, hey, like we could have a copy of the data, which is the full data, but we could have an anonymized version of the data. And then we could even have an aggregated version of the data. And depending on the use case, I'll give you one of these data sets or the other. Like, I think that we're just starting to get to that point now where we're like, oh, we don't have to lock down the whole thing. We can actually have a few options here. But I think that differential privacy is still very much something that hasn't been fully reconciled yet.
So before we kind of wrap up here and open up to everybody else, I have one quick last question here. Is we have GDPR, CCPA. What's next? Like, what should the enterprise private sector be on the lookout? What's the next thing that you see from your purview that we should be looking out and be prepared for?
So I think with both the GDPR and the California bill that is large enough economies and large enough regulators that is going to force federal privacy regulation. With how much data is shared across borders, the federal government is going to have no choice but to take a look at this. So there are going to be a lot of bills introduced in the next 2, 3, 4 years that really start to deal with this. And again, that gets at the question of what are the parameters for safe and private data. And I think that having some good answers about that is something that private enterprise can do. And, thinking about that from the perspective of the federal government will become really important, right? Because, you know, if you look at some of the largest data firms in the world, they are going to want to retain privacy protections that allow them to run on the same profit margins. And I'm going to tell you, federal policymakers are some savvy people, and they are going to ask them sharp questions. Hopefully their staffers and their committee staffers are definitely going to be able to think about that very critically. So having some good, solid, you know, good faith, especially from not the big three, about how to have good privacy, responsible privacy protected data will be, I think, something that will be a huge conversation in the next couple of years.
Well, thank you, Corinna, for your time here. I want to wrap this up here before we open up to everybody else. But again, thank you so much. We really appreciate this conversation. And I am leaving so happy with this analogy of the car and speeding and the brake. That is
great.
I'm going to start using this in talks, and I'm going to be writing about this. I'll give you the credit for it. Thank you so much.
Don't credit me. It was definitely from this other woman. I'll send you her name, Kelsey. She was the one who introduced me to it. So.
All right. Let me go. Thanks for everything.